The Texas sun burned relentlessly over Willow Creek Ranch, stretching its golden rays across the dry fields. Dust rose in small clouds where cattle wandered, their lowing sounds drifting toward the main barn. The ranch hands had finished their morning work and were gathered near the stables, wiping sweat from their brows and sharing idle conversation. Among them was Luke Tanner, a quiet and reserved man who never revealed much about himself. His hands were rough from years of labor, but something about him didn't quite fit. Unlike the others, he never joined in the boasting about past rodeos or the complaints about long days. He worked hard, spoke little, and kept to himself. Rumors swirled among the ranch hands about Luke's past. Some claimed he had run from the law, others suggested he had lost everything in a bad deal, and a few simply thought he was a drifter with nowhere else to go. The speculation never seemed to bother him. He kept his head down, completing his work with a quiet efficiency that made him indispensable to the ranch. Willow Creek Ranch was one of the largest cattle operations in the area, owned by Dean Hollis, a man known for his sharp business sense and even sharper temper. His daughter, Claire, had recently returned from college, determined to take an active role in managing the land. Unlike many ranchers' daughters who avoided the hard labor, she worked alongside the men, riding out to check fences and making sure the livestock were well cared for. She expected respect, and she got it. Luke had first caught Claire's attention when she noticed the way he handled horses. He moved with a quiet confidence, reading their body language with an understanding that came naturally. Unlike the other hands, who often tried to break a horse's will through force, he worked with patience. Over time, Claire found herself watching him, intrigued by the way he seemed both completely at ease and somehow separate from the world around him. Despite her attempts to learn more about him, Luke remained an enigma. When asked about his past, he gave vague answers or changed the subject. He never spoke about family, never mentioned where he had lived before, and never stayed in town long enough for anyone to pry. It was as if he had appeared at the ranch one day, fully formed, with no history behind him. One evening, as the sun cast long shadows over the land, Claire rode back toward the barn after a long day checking cattle. Near the stables, she spotted Luke repairing a section of broken fence. His shirt was covered in dust, sweat darkening the fabric, but his movements remained steady, methodical. She dismounted and watched for a moment, noting the way he focused completely on his task, as if nothing else in the world existed. Nearby, a group of ranch hands gathered around an old pickup truck, laughter and low murmurs filling the air. The sound of paper rustling cut through the evening quiet. Jesse Crowley, one of the louder and more boisterous ranch hands, held up a newspaper, his face twisted in a mixture of amusement and disbelief. The others leaned in, their voices rising in excitement. A sudden shift in the atmosphere made Luke pause. The low hum of conversation had ceased, replaced by an eerie silence. When he turned toward the group, every pair of eyes was locked on him. Jesse, still holding the newspaper, stepped forward, shaking the pages slightly as if emphasizing the significance of what was printed. There, on the front page, was a headline in bold letters: "Missing Heir to Tanner Industries Still Unaccounted For." Beneath the text, a grainy photo stared back at him, his own face unmistakable despite the years that had passed. The weight of recognition settled over the group. Expressions shifted from confusion to realization, and finally, to something bordering on awe. Claire's gaze lingered on the newspaper, then lifted toward Luke, searching his face for confirmation. He said nothing, but the truth was already laid bare. The quiet ranch hand, the man who had worked beside them in the dust and heat, was no ordinary cowboy. He was Luke Tanner, the missing heir to one of the wealthiest business empires in the state. The revelation spread through Willow Creek Ranch like wildfire. The quiet, unassuming ranch hand they had all worked alongside wasn't just another drifter looking for a paycheck. He was Luke Tanner, heir to one of the largest business empires in Texas. The news unsettled the ranch hands, twisting their perception of the man they had come to know. The easy camaraderie they once shared with him was replaced by a quiet unease. The bunkhouse, which had always been filled with laughter and idle chatter, now held an air of suspicion. After the discovery, Luke went about his work as if nothing had changed. He still rose before dawn, still saddled his horse in silence, still performed every task without complaint. But the others weren't the same around him. Conversations stopped when he entered a room. Men who once shared their stories with him now avoided his gaze. It wasn't anger or hostility. It was something more complicated. None of them had ever worked alongside a millionaire before, and they didn't know what to make of it. Jesse Crowley, however, knew exactly what he wanted to make of it. He watched Luke closely, his sharp eyes measuring every movement, every interaction. Jesse had never cared much for the quiet man who had kept to himself, but now he saw an opportunity. People didn't walk away from fortunes unless they had something to hide, and Jesse intended to find out what it was. Claire Hollis hadn't spoken to Luke since the newspaper had exposed his identity. She had lingered by the barn that night, watching him from a distance, wondering why someone with the kind of wealth and power he had been born into would choose a life of hard labor. The questions gnawed at her, and she knew there was only one way to get answers. At sunrise the next morning, she saddled her horse and rode out to the northern pasture, following the path Luke had taken. It didn't take long to find him. He was alone, working on a section of fence, his sleeves rolled up, sweat already glistening on his skin. He moved with the same steady, deliberate pace as always, as if the events of the previous night had never happened. Claire dismounted and approached him. Luke barely acknowledged her, continuing to work as if she weren't standing there. She waited, expecting him to say something, to offer some kind of explanation. When he didn't, frustration stirred within her. She had grown up around men who talked too much, cattle brokers, businessmen, ranch hands who all had something to prove. Luke was the opposite. He never demanded attention, never sought approval. And yet, here he was, a man with a past that belonged in headlines, hammering nails into a fence post like he had no place else in the world to be. Back at the ranch, the other hands struggled to make sense of the revelation. Some felt betrayed, thinking that Luke had deceived them. Others simply couldn't reconcile the man they had worked alongside with the wealthy heir described in the newspaper. The uncertainty spread through the crew like an invisible force, unsettling everything it touched. Jesse, however, had no doubts. He didn't care why Luke Tanner had walked away from his fortune. He cared about what that meant for him. There was leverage and secrets, and he intended to use it. That night, while the other ranch hands settled into their bunks, Jesse slipped away and rode into town. He made his way to the local bar, a dimly lit place where men gathered to drink, gossip, and make quiet deals. He found what he was looking for soon enough, an old cowboy with a face lined by years of hard living, a man who had been in Texas long enough to know everything about everyone. Jesse sat beside him, ordered a whiskey, and casually mentioned the name Luke Tanner. The reaction was immediate. The old man's eyes flickered with recognition, and a knowing smirk crossed his face. "You mean to tell me," the old man drawled, "that Tanner boy's been working as a ranch hand? Ain't that something?" Jesse leaned in, lowering his voice. "What's his story?" The old man took a slow sip of his drink, considering. Then, with a glance around to make sure no one else was listening, he began to talk. And as the words spilled from his lips, Jesse's smirk grew. By the time he left the bar that night, he knew exactly what Luke Tanner had been running from, and he knew just how to use it. Tension lingered over Willow Creek Ranch like a storm waiting to break. Ever since the newspaper had exposed Luke Tanner's true identity, the air around him had changed. The men he had worked alongside now regarded him with suspicion, their once friendly conversations turning into hushed whispers. The bunkhouse, once filled with easy camaraderie, had become a place of silent glances and uneasy stares. Luke had expected it. People didn't like secrets, especially from someone they thought they understood. It was easier to trust a man who had nothing than one who had walked away from everything. He continued his work without acknowledgement of the shift, sticking to his routine with the same quiet precision as always. But no amount of hard labor could erase the weight of the truth. He wasn't just another ranch hand anymore. He was the heir to a collapsed empire, a man who had abandoned wealth, power, and responsibility. Among the ranch hands, Jesse Crowley had taken the greatest interest in the revelation. He had always been the type to poke at things until they cracked, and now, he had found something worth breaking. The discovery of Luke's past had given him an edge, a sense of power that he didn't intend to waste. The way he watched Luke now was different, less like a coworker and more like a predator circling prey. Claire Hollis had been watching too, but with a different intent. She had never been one to accept things at face value, and Luke Tanner's presence at the ranch had never quite made sense. The newspaper had answered some questions, but left many more in its place. A man with his background didn't simply disappear without a reason. She had tried to confront him once, hoping for an explanation, but Luke had given her nothing. His silence had frustrated her, but more than that, it had deepened her curiosity. She knew men who talked too much, who boasted about every accomplishment, but Luke was the opposite. He was controlled, deliberate, and unwavering. That kind of restraint didn't come without reason. The growing unease among the ranch hands reached a breaking point one evening when Jesse returned from town with new information. He had been gone most of the night, and when he came back, his swagger carried an air of certainty. In his hand, he clutched a folded document, the kind of thing that didn't belong in a place like Willow Creek. As the men gathered outside the bunkhouse, Jesse stood at the center, holding their attention with calculated ease. His voice carried across the yard as he revealed what he had learned. The newspaper had only told part of the story. What it hadn't mentioned was the collapse of Tanner Industries, the financial disaster that had wiped out millions, the scandal that had left Luke's name tied to failure. The document in Jesse's hand contained the details, a list of financial losses, legal battles, and the accusations that had followed. Luke stood motionless as the information was laid out before the men he had worked beside for over a year. The weight of it pressed against him, but he didn't react. He had known this day would come. The murmurs among the ranch hands shifted. Before, their unease had been rooted in resentment, the idea that they had unknowingly worked alongside a man of privilege. But now, the feeling had changed. The man they had once assumed to be a millionaire wasn't just someone who had hidden his wealth. He was someone who had lost it all. Jesse let the revelation sink in, his satisfaction evident. He had done what he set out to do. He had taken control of the narrative, shifting Luke from a figure of mystery to one of disgrace. The ranch hands no longer saw him as one of them, nor as a man above them. Instead, he had become something in between, an outcast, a man with nowhere else to go. Claire, standing at a distance, watched the scene unfold with a mix of frustration and concern. The men had drawn their own conclusions, filling in the gaps with assumptions and speculation. But something about the way Luke remained still, refusing to defend himself, made her certain that there was more to the story. He wasn't just running from failure. He was running from something much bigger. And whatever it was, it had finally caught up to him. The weight of Jesse's revelation hung over Willow Creek Ranch, settling into the cracks of every interaction. The men who had once worked alongside Luke without question now kept their distance, their gazes sharper, their movements around him more deliberate. He had become an outsider in a place where he had once found purpose. No one confronted him directly, but their judgment was clear. Luke continued his work without complaint, as he always had. He rode out before sunrise, tending to the cattle, repairing fences, and carrying out every task expected of him. But the rhythm of ranch life no longer carried the same quiet peace it once had. Every conversation he overheard, every glance in his direction, was a reminder that he no longer belonged. Jesse, satisfied with the damage he had done, carried himself with newfound confidence. He had exposed the truth, pulled back the curtain on Luke Tanner's past, and ensured that no one would look at him the same way again. He spoke loudly in the bunkhouse, dropping comments about trust and deception, feeding the unease that had taken root. But the storm Jesse had set in motion was not yet finished. 3 days after the revelation, a black car rolled up the long dirt road leading to the ranch house. It was the kind of vehicle that didn't belong on a cattle ranch, polished, precise, and out of place among the dust and sweat of the land. The moment it appeared, a quiet ripple moved through the ranch hands. They watched from a distance as the car pulled to a stop and two men in tailored suits stepped out. Luke was in the barn when he heard the sound of approaching boots, firm, measured, and unmistakably out of place. He didn't turn around immediately, but he knew who had come for him. The men weren't from the law, but they carried the same air of authority. They had been searching for him for a long time. One of them produced a folder, thick with documents, and extended it toward him. The weight of it was heavy, not just in paper, but in consequence. Outside, the ranch hands lingered near the bunkhouse, watching the scene unfold in hushed silence. Jesse stood among them, arms crossed, his smirk widening. He had expected something like this, had counted on it. He had never believed Luke could run forever. Claire stepped onto the porch of the ranch house, watching from a distance. Unlike the others, she wasn't waiting for a spectacle. She was waiting for an answer. Luke took the folder, his expression unreadable. He flipped through the pages, scanning the contents, though he already knew what they held. The men in suits didn't say much. They didn't need to. Their presence alone was enough. The past had finally caught up to him. He had spent over a year in the quiet of the ranch, believing, for a while, that he could disappear into this life, that he could trade boardrooms for open fields, suits for denim, the weight of expectations for the simplicity of hard labor. But there had never been an escape. There had only been borrowed time. Without a word, he handed the folder back. The men in suits exchanged a glance, then nodded. They had their answer. Luke stepped past them and walked toward the stables. He saddled his horse with the same quiet efficiency he always had. No one spoke. The ranch hands remained where they were, uncertain of what came next. Then, without hesitation, Luke Tanner swung himself onto his horse and rode out. He didn't take anything with him. No bags, no belongings. Just the clothes on his back and the dust trailing behind him. He didn't look back at the ranch house, the bunkhouse, or the men who had once been his co-workers. He simply rode toward the horizon, disappearing into the golden light of the setting sun. The black car remained for a while longer before the men got back inside and drove off, leaving nothing behind but the dust kicked up by their tires. Back at the bunkhouse, Jesse's smirk faded. He had wanted to see Luke broken, but there had been no desperation in his departure, only acceptance. Claire remained on the porch long after the dust had settled. She had spent months trying to understand Luke Tanner, and in the end, he had left her with more questions than answers. By morning, the ranch had returned to its usual routine. The cattle still needed tending, the fences still needed mending. But an empty bunk remained in the bunkhouse, a quiet reminder of the man who had once worked among them. Luke Tanner was gone, and the world would go on without him. But for those who had known him, even briefly, the mystery of who he truly was, and what he had been running from, would never fade.